if this topic is interesting to you, and as Tracy mentioned, like the reason why I think this topic is important is because when we're talking about a Christian sexual ethic, we're no longer just talking about something that's limited to religion, because the source of ethics, the way that we think about this, has actually seeped into culture so much that even in my research, it's somewhat hard to separate people's subconscious values from what is explicitly Christian values. And so that's why I'm doing this research toward a new Christian sexual ethic. Feel free to connect with me at Dr. Kevin Jensen, pretty much any online platform, and let's get started. So what I'm looking at today, I'm actually taking us through my research process with hope for some feedback on this. So framing the problem, the purpose of my study, I'll spend a bit of time on methodology and then provide a couple of examples of what I'm doing and close with the implications of the findings. So when we begin, we're framing this problem. I've already talked a little bit about the cultural context, but there's a whole number of different angles that make the study of a sexual ethic important. Part of this is that when people think about the sexual ethic, we have our legal codes. This is what is allowed. This is what is not allowed. I really liked the previous presentation. We have our social codes of what's cool, where you get labeled as mentally stable versus not. And this actually makes its way into our language and how we talk about things. And we'll talk about the word sodomy for a little bit and the source of where that comes from, which is a biblical term, which means something entirely different, as we find out today, than it does in modern language use. We also have our literature. And if you think about porn as a literature, this is where we get a whole lot of what we think of as normal in sexuality. And then you have the cultural movement, particularly in the United States, over the past 100 years towards sexual liberation, or in other words, no longer feeling constrained. You also then have the specifically Christian context where people are looking to the Bible as, all right, so what is our moral code? And when you look at that, over the past 100 years, we've had this gradual opening up from a point where interracial marriage was frowned upon 100 years ago as non-biblical, to moving toward gender equality between a husband and a wife, to recognizing that not everybody was attracted to the opposite sex, to finally now people are asking questions, all right, so now that we can function in various gender roles or even change our body parts, like how do we deal with that? And so you have a whole lot of questions among Christianity about what's going on, but you don't have a lot of conversation about it. But when you look at all of this altogether, we really have three primary ethical frameworks that you can abstract from cultural and Christian conversations. The first one is the conversation about consent. As long as we both are consenting adults, then sex is great. Second one is thou shalt not judge. This is largely seen in your post-Christian or people who set up against Christian ethics and be like, all right, stop judging me with your ethics. And that's the new ethical framework, is you can't tell me what to do. And then you also have then the standard, which we also saw reflected in the previous presentation, that relationships or commitment are what validates the morality of sex. And so these three existing frameworks are coming into something of a cultural clash. And you have, especially in the United States, Christianity losing its voice in the cultural conversation about sex because it has not kept up with what's going on. The conversation is largely in the dark because of fear and shame of social stigma, because we don't actually have anymore a clear sexual ethic. So the purpose of this study, I moved into this study based on another presentation I made earlier this year called The Problem of Porneia. Porneia is a Greek word that has been translated into the English Bible either as fornication or as sexual immorality. And if you're curious about knowing more of that, you can see my presentation on my YouTube channel. Just look for Dr. Kevin Jensen. And what I do is I look at the translation, the etymology, and particularly the rhetoric of how we understand this word, because it so strongly influences how we talk about sexual ethics. And what happens is in Christianity, when we look at the Bible, it's so easy to go to an ancient text, 4,000 years of writings, to different groups of people by so many different authors, and we bring in what is called secondary rhetoric. Now, this is a theory by Mikhail Bakhtin, who is my favorite rhetorical theorist, and he talks about secondary rhetoric, which is like the meaning that we abstract from primary rhetoric. And primary rhetoric could be understood as like stories, as material expressions. And so just say you have the biblical text being primary rhetoric. This is a story of what happened or how somebody wrote. Secondary would be like the values that we read when we look in that. And a lot of times people don't realize that they're functioning in secondary instead of primary rhetoric. Another thing that I'm attempting to do with this study is to look at the biblical narrative as evolving over time. This is something that not a lot of studies actually do when it comes to looking at Christianity and then looking specifically at how Jesus is juxtaposed with Judaism. Because the Bible being a collection of both Jewish text and Christian text, with Jesus kind of stuck right in the middle as making a big difference. And this is like the roots of Christianity. So this is the basis for my study, is I want to ground a sexual ethic based on these ideas. And I'm specifically looking at the sexual expression, not about the relationships, not about the social implications, which is where a lot of, you'll have a lot of research, particularly in the homosexual ethics question, ends up concluding, as long as, and again, I love that I'm following Tracy's presentation, as long as there's a committed monogamous relationship, this is somehow valued more, because we don't have a sexual ethic, we have a relational ethic right now. So seeking this sexual ethic, as opposed to taking a quantitative approach where I add all of the passages together where sex is mentioned and then run some analysis on that, I'm actually taking a qualitative approach, which allows the text to have a multiplicity of meanings. And now this actually aligns with ancient writing styles, and really not writing styles, but speaking styles, where all kinds of meanings are embedded in the single story. And then in order to unpack the meanings, taking a rhetorical approach. And this is the purpose of rhetoric, after all, is to unpack the meaning that has been embedded in the text. So my approach, my methodology, has been interviewing significant text as self-contained rhetorical entities in an evolving conversation. A couple of examples that I'll provide 3 if I have time. The first one is Matthew 5. This is Jesus speaking, a famous passage that a lot of people use because it talks about looking on a woman with lust. And this is a passage that comes into conversations, particularly about pornography. And part of this is because we make an assumption about what lust is. And this is, again, I've unpacked all of these in different teachings that I've done, just providing these here as an example. But when you zoom in, we realize that we're not going to understand this rhetorical meaning of the passage unless we can understand what words like lust and adultery meant to the original hearers. This is not about pornography. This is not about nudity. This is about an intentional response to someone. And just to tell you a bit more about the method, we have the rhetorical considerations. What is not said here? And a lot of people are not aware to look for this because we're not bringing rhetoric into our analysis. Who is not addressed? You notice that this is particularly, and if you're looking at the cultural context, this is being addressed primarily to men. And also, this is not talking about lesbian attraction. So really kind of some interesting things that you can find when you begin to bring rhetorical considerations and zoom in on the text. You need to understand the terms and how they are in relation to each other. And why is it, you might even ask one of these questions, why is it that Jesus uses the term adultery instead of the term porneia, which was mentioned earlier, which means he's trying to draw our attention specifically toward something. Now, I'm not going to give us the answer here, but feel free to check in with me later if you're curious. The second passage I took a look at for this study is Genesis chapter 19. Now, this is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a city that was destroyed. It sounds almost like it's destroyed by a volcano if you look at some of the imagery that's taking place in there. Now, this is the origin of our word sodomy, which in today's culture is used in legal codes to refer to anything from oral sex to anal sex to other things that people think are outside of the norm. And we have things called sodomy laws. However, when you go and look at the passage in the Bible, we're now zooming out. So this is another function of rhetoric. We're zooming out to see As opposed to like, how do the words relate to each other in the sentence, as in passage 1, we're looking how does the full passage relate to its broader context. And you have actually the author of the book of Genesis likes to do something where he's placing one story of a person in contrast with another story. This happens all throughout the book of Genesis and through the full Pentateuch. You have this imagery that is meant to teach us something. And so chapter 19 is set up in contrast with chapter 18. And chapter 18 actually provides an explicit explanation as to what we ought to be focusing on in chapter 19. The focus, even though both chapters and that whole section, that whole book is full of all kinds of interesting sexual encounters, the contrast here is with Abraham. And the question is about righteousness and justice. And you see this demonstrated by Abraham with the question in the passage: how are people going to respond to strangers? What is our approach to hospitality? The story in chapter 18 begins with Abraham welcoming strangers, providing them a feast. Then you have Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, who lives in the city of Sodom, also welcoming the strangers and providing them a feast. Then you have one verse in that passage, which talks about how the city welcomed the strangers. They wanted to know them. And the word to know in the Hebrew includes a euphemism for having sexual relations. And because it was men desiring to know these visitors who were also men, people take this passage entirely out of context and say the city was destroyed because there were homosexuals who were in the city. So we understand that by zooming out, we can then begin to change our understanding of the text. And as we notice our understanding changing, that's going to drive us toward a new Christian sexual ethic. No longer reading our secondary rhetoric back into the text, but abstracting from a primary story. Finally, passage number 3, you have this approach to reading without bias. This is something I've looked at in Romans chapter 1, is a hot button passage. And again, this is often pulled out in arguments about homosexuality. And we have to look at who is addressed. We look at the consistent theme of righteousness, which is something that we see actually in all 3 of these texts. And then we ask the question, how does the language that is used here direct our emphasis? If you talk to most people, or if you hear this read in a church, the emphasis is on the sexual activity that occurs in 3 different verses. However, the emphasis of the entire passage is on something totally different. And the emphasis is on, as you can see here in the slides, righteousness and on the suppression of knowledge, and how people who knew God began to change how they related to God, and that resulted in a change of their sexual expression. And so when we begin to see things like this, you start to see that the sexual state is an indicator of the spiritual state, and it is the spiritual state that precedes the sexual state. There is this link that's coming through. And you also have a progression in the passage toward a final outcome of injustice, violence, and social disintegration. So there is a lot to read in here, and we don't have time to go into all of this. But what I'm encouraging us toward is when we use rhetoric to analyze these passages, we're seeing something entirely different. Thank you. So a couple of the themes that I see here, from just interviewing these 3 texts, we have a theme of justice being incredibly significant. This is explicit in some of the contexts and implicit in others. Another theme that we see, and I would actually consider these to be sub-themes in my research because this is only 3 of a multitude of passages that can be interviewed here. We have the spiritual significance of the body, which is something I'm going to bring in on the next page. And then also noting that the sexual ethics are related to intention, looking on a woman to, or responding, bringing out the strangers in order to. And this is what the scripture passages are actually using to define what is ethical behavior and what is not. So the implications of this is we can look at this idea, and this is ultimately where I think my findings are going to lead, that sex is sacred because it symbolizes something about God. Now this is drawn from even more passages than I provided as an example, and that is part of a broader spiritual experience. So the emphasis of the new Christian sexual ethic is on somebody's spiritual encounter with God, somebody's embodiment and expression of that through sexuality. And in order for this to be something that works for people, we actually have to have knowledge. We need sex education. And so here we have, instead of the assumption that ignorance and innocence equals morality, we now have knowledge and choice. And so this is a huge shift in how we understand. I think our next steps are continued analysis, bringing more of these passages into conversation with each other. I think it's important that we start looking at how do we bring sex education into a Christian context. But the challenges are that there's two new ethics of affirmation and the old ethic of repression. Both of these things are pretty trendy right now, particularly with your no-fap movement online, and then also with affirmation in your more liberal Christian churches. So the new Christian sexual ethic, as you can see, my conclusion right here, sex has meaning, and our choice is either to hide or reveal its sacred symbolism. So any questions? Would appreciate some feedback on the methodology or on the approach as a whole. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Kevin Jensen. Now let us proceed to our question and answer. We have 5 minutes. Who's going to start?